Hello YouTube, this is Johnny with the first episode of an ongoing series that I call Profiles in Courage, where I discuss important but mostly lesser known historical figures that I believe should get more exposure because of their courage and virtue, people who have stood for exemplary things, and comported themselves with the highest degree of moral and intellectual excellence capable of human beings. I believe Kurt Huber and the rest of the White Rose are a great example of this. So, who were the White Rose? The organization was founded by two medical students at Ludwig Maximilian's University of Munich, siblings, in fact, Sophie and Hans Scholl, in response to the soul-crushing intellectual social control mechanisms of the Nazis and, more specifically, the euthanasia policies that were implemented in 1940-41. Some prominent members besides Sophie and Hans were Professor Kurt Huber, who became something of a mentor to them, as well as other medical students at Ludwig Maximilian's University of Munich. Alexander Smorel, a military man and artist, Willy Graf, another medical student who participated in making anti-Nazi graffiti and recruiting members in other cities, and Christoph Probst, who came in a little later towards the end. The main goal of the White Rose was to create intellectual opposition to the Nazi regime and embolden resistance. They did things like paint graffiti in various places, things like freedom and down with Hitler, and they distributed pamphlets as widely as possible. 6 of these pamphlets were produced and distributed. Their contents were influenced by German bourgeois intellectuals such as Goethe and Schiller, as well as the Bible, Aristotle, Lao Tzu. The pamphlets were produced by hand and with scarce resources due to the rationing going on at the time because of the war effort. And of course, their activities were considered treasonous by the authorities. They knew what they were getting themselves into, and they did it anyway. The opening of the first leaflet went this way. Nothing is so unworthy of a civilized nation as allowing itself to be governed without opposition by an irresponsible clique that has yielded to base instinct. It is certain that today every honest German is ashamed of his government. Who among us has any conception of the dimensions of shame that will befall us and our children when one day the veil has fallen from our eyes and the most horrible of crimes that infinitely outdistance every human measure, reach the light of day? If the German people are already so corrupted and spiritually crushed that they do not raise a hand, frivolously trusting in a questionable faith in lawful order and history, if they surrender man's highest principle, that which raises him above all other God's creatures, his free will, if they abandon the will to take decisive action and turn the wheel of history and thus subject it to their own rational decision, if they are so devoid of all individuality, having already gone so far down along the road toward turning into a spiritless and cowardly mass, then yes, they deserve their downfall. The rest of these pamphlets are also of great interest, and they're well constructed. They're easy to find. I'll leave links to some sources for them in the description. If you're interested in this stuff, you should definitely check them out. Eventually, unfortunately, most of the members of the group were found out and executed. So there's plenty of information about the White Rose. There's some documentaries about them, some books, and stuff like that. The most important one is probably the book, The White Rose, written by another Scholl sibling. It's pretty easy to find if you're interested. Though the story of the White Rose is fascinating, today I want to concentrate on Kurt Huber as a model of the courageous intellectual. So let's get started with a bit of biographical information about him. Kurt Huber was born in Chur, Switzerland on October 24th, 1893. Both of his parents were educated people and musicians. He suffered from rickets as well as diphtheria, so he was excused from military service and instead became an intellectual and professor. Huber studied music, particularly German folk music, psychology, and philosophy at the University of Munich. He completed his education in 1917 and earned a reputation for grand lectures on figures such as Leibniz, Hegel, Kant, etc., as well as being recognized as musically talented and respected in that field as well. He married Clara Schlickenreiter in 1929, and they had 2 children together, Brigitte and Wolfgang. His lectures at the university were often thinly, or not so thinly, veiled criticisms of the Nazi regime couched in irony or humor, and this drew many students to him, including Sophie and Hans Scholl. He became something of a mentor to them and was the author of the 6th and final pamphlet that was distributed. There actually was a 7th pamphlet, but they were arrested before it was published. So here's an excerpt of the 6th, the last pamphlet that he authored. It says, "We grew up in a state in which all free expression of opinion is unscrupulously suppressed. The Hitler Youth, the SA, the SS have tried to drug us, to revolutionize us, to regiment us in the most promising young years of our lives. Philosophical training is the name given to the despicable method by which our budding intellectual development is muffled in a fog of empty phrases. A system of selection of leaders, at once unimaginably devilish and narrow-minded, trains up its future party bigwigs in the castles of the knightly order to become godless, impudent, and conscienceless exploiters and executioners, blind, stupid hangers-on of the Führer. We intellectual workers are the ones who should put obstacles in the path of this caste of overlords. It's interesting to note, by the way, that Huber was actually pretty conservative, and he was anti-communist. So at first, he wasn't quite as willing as the other members of the White Rose to go along with the pamphlet plan, but eventually they were able to change his mind. He was interested in defending the German spirit and so forth, and thought that the brutality of the regime was a disgusting stain on that spirit. So here we have this intellectual, this fine, rational, artistic person who is very wont to care about his nation and people. He knew he had to stand up and make a difference regardless of the personal cost to himself. I think that's one of the most ennobling things about the White Rose is that, they knew that after a point, it doesn't matter what it costs you personally, because if you live in a world that is so full of evil and horrors, particularly while other people are apathetic, it makes life hardly worth living. So you have to try to change it. Once people have been forced to become less than human, there's not really so much left to lose in a lot of ways, right? This could perhaps be why Huber eventually decided to join up with the White Rose. Interestingly and telling as to the power of the brainwashing program in Nazi Germany, it was just a common janitor that turned them in. Talk about the banality of evil, right? So this is how it is when people are brutally forced to live in such totalitarian conditions where they can't express themselves. There's no freedom of speech or opinion or of conscience. Even something as simple as publishing pamphlets becomes a death sentence, imposed not only from the government, but from your very friends and neighbors. I think the important thing to understand is this episode of history really brings home the connection between the ability of reason to assert itself, however flawed it may be from someone's perspective, and liberty. You have to be able to make your own decisions regarding your person and the values that you share and how you defend them, and what actions you are allowed to decide to take. In short, without being able to freely reason, you can't freely act, and vice versa. When regimes become too powerful, there's not much left to do but to speak out. Flying in the face of those who believe that speech and theory are useless or impractical, it's important to point out that some of the first things that tyrants always do when they get into power is to control speech and publishing. And they punish those who dare to speak out or say things that are inconsistent with the interests of the regime. It's a scenario that has sadly played out countless times throughout history. From the introduction of censorship laws in early China to censorship in ancient Greece and Rome. The word censorship, by the way, comes from the office of the censor in ancient Rome. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, which is a list of banned books published by the Catholic Church. The last one was published in the 1940s, which is just incredible. Library burnings, book burnings, destruction of historical sites, etc. has been a consistent theme throughout human history. Even today, some people support government censorship and control of information. It's a battle that will probably be waged for all of time. But unfortunately, this battle was ended for the White Rose members in February 1943. Hans and Sophie were found out and reported to the Gestapo by a janitor as they were distributing many copies of that 6th leaflet around the school after lectures, and they were arrested. When Kurt Huber heard about this, he attempted to get rid of as much of the evidence as he could, but he was arrested a little under 2 weeks later. They were accused of treason, and after a mock trial, they were sentenced to execution by guillotine. In the few months that Huber had left, while in prison awaiting execution, he attempted to write a biography of Leibniz, but was unable to finish it. While he asked for a stay of execution to finish it, he was denied it. Adolf Hitler actually signed the letter responding to his family's request to not have him executed, which chillingly said, "I reject all petitions for mercy." So he was executed July 13th of that year. So it's really emblematic of his strength as an intellectual that he just kept working even while he was in prison, trying to make as much difference as he was able to regardless of the situation around him. Really amazing and inspiring to me. Unfortunately, they were unable to change much in terms of the regime, but many copies of that 6th leaflet were actually dropped onto German cities as they became liberated by the Allies. It's difficult to really know how much they were able to practically do or what would have happened had they not been murdered in terms of their effect on their countrymen. or what it would have been, right? The most important thing, though, about them today is that they now stand as an inspiring symbol of standing up for what's right, including the right of people to express themselves freely and to criticize their political and social leaders. There have been a couple of documentaries and a few books written about the White Rose, but I find that a lot of people still don't know who they were. So I hope this video I can at least contribute to bringing them a little bit more to the public consciousness as much as I can, so people can understand the very real dangers of totalitarianism, radical politics, and the importance of free speech and criticism of authority. Here's a quote that I found I'd like to read from Kurt Huber's trial to wrap this video up. So this is Kurt Huber. "You have stripped from me the rank and privileges of the professorship and the doctoral degree which I earned, and you have set me at the level of the lowest criminal. The inner dignity of the university teacher, of the frank, courageous protester of his philosophical and political views, no trial for treason can rob me of that. My actions and my intentions will be justified in the inevitable course of history, such is my firm faith. I hope to God that the inner strength that will vindicate my deeds will in good time spring forth from my own people. I have done as I had to on the prompting of my inner voice." So that's all I got for this episode, but stay tuned and keep your wits about you. Peace.